Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our combined Sunday school class. We're glad to have you. You may have gotten a little hint from what Nancy was playing that this is a special music program this morning. We're doing a little Christmas music. I hope you don't mind that. So I'll say my ho-ho-hos now and invite you to sing with me hymn number 219. Number 219. Not trying to be funny, but we've been doing Christmas in July here for more years than I've been around. Bill Lambert did it back in the 70s, and John Truitt, of course, did it. And so we decided to continue that little tradition. It's not consumerism or commercialism. It's just the fact that we can celebrate Christmas any time of year. And if you're going to do it in a hot month, maybe it'll make us think a little bit about cool weather in December. I'll take that as my excuse anyway. If you'll turn back one page, 217, number 217, our next hymn, it was written by Isaac Watts, the greatest hymn writer, one of the greatest hymn writers of all. It was a poem that he wrote back in 1719, and he had no intention of it being a Christmas carol or a Christmas hymn. It was a parody of Psalm 98, which is that wonderful song about sing to the Lord, sing with timbrel and dance, sing with joy and use your voice. But he had taken the later part of the poem and put it into something that sort of talked about the season. And another great hymn writer, 100 years later, wrote a melody that just can't be forgotten. He took some of the melodies out of the Handel Messiah and used them to create this wonderful hymn, Joy to the World. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare His room. And heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing, and to sing the third verse. No more the sins and sorrows grow, nor thorns infest the ground. He comes to make his blessings flow, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found, far as the curse is found. And the last verse. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations through the glories of his righteousness, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love, and wonders of his love. Great hymn. And again, I said this when we were singing patriotic hymns. It's so nice to look at it, all of you. Most of you are looking up at me and not looking at the words because you know them or have known them for a good part of your life. That's the joy of this. Our thanks to Nancy Fogarty this morning for accompanying us with our little Christmas tradition, if you will. Nancy, thanks for being here and being a part of this. In all honesty, it's not an important thing, but you know me, I always tell you the things that aren't important. The idea of Christmas in July isn't a Hallmark Channel thing. I said we've been doing it here for 50 years. But it actually had its, I looked this up, the all-knowing, all-seeing Google and Wikipedia came up and it told me something I didn't know. The idea of Christmas in July was actually started in 1930. First known reference of it is July of 1933 at a summer camp up in Brevard, North Carolina called the Keystone Camp. And they celebrated Christmas there every July for the campers because it gave them something exciting to look forward to. They put up Christmas trees and they had Santa Claus and they had all of that. So it's a North Carolina tradition, even if you didn't know it. I certainly didn't know it, but it's just a little piece of trivia. Let's go back another page, 214 for our prayer hymn this morning, hymn number 214. Like our opening hymn, this was originally a poem that was written in 1868, just after the Civil War, for a Sunday school class up in Philadelphia, so it's appropriate that we do it here. O little town of Bethlehem. And please stand on the second verse. Sing the last verse. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in, be born in us today. We hear the Christmas angels, the great glad tidings tell. Oh, come to us, abide with us, our Lord Emmanuel. Thank you all so much for letting us continue our little tradition of Christmas in July. I hope you have a lovely, beautiful Sunday afternoon. Stay cool.
Thank you, Nancy. I appreciate those extra little notes that aren't in the music. And Lane, naturally, we thank you. Susie White is filling in on our prayer for this morning.
Bow your heads, please. Heavenly Father, we are just so grateful to be here today, and we thank you for providing a teacher for us every week that we can learn more about you in your word. Thank you for all our blessings, and be with those who don't have the advantages and the blessings that we do, and show us how we can be helpful and how we can help them. And then I'm just going to read from Numbers, one of my favorite scriptures, and the blessing that was given in Numbers. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face on you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance to you and give you peace. Amen.
Please be seated. Welcome everyone to the Young Men's Bible class. We appreciate all the visitors, the guests, the Agape class, and the men of the Young Men's Bible class. I have two items here in the way of announcements. As a reminder, the Young Men's Bible class will be enjoying a night at the First National Bank Ballpark on Wednesday, August 30th, 2023. Food will be served, and we will have seating in a suite and general seating as well. Bob Lovejoy will have a sign-up sheet beginning each Sunday, August 8th through Sunday, August 27th, during the Sunday school hour. The Grasshoppers will be playing the Hickory Crawdads at 6:30 p.m. So you'll want to get registered with Bob Lovejoy. Nancy gave me a note concerning Bill Giddings. He's in intensive care at Duke Hospital after having heart surgery, and he's not doing as well as he could, so we'll pray for him, please. Are there any announcements? Anybody want to comment on anything? Okay. There were 4 men waiting in the hospital waiting room. Their wives were expecting to have babies. So they had read through all the old magazines and everything else, and all of a sudden one of the nurses came in and said to one of the 4 gentlemen, she said, "Congratulations, you are the father of twins." And he said, "Really? I can't believe that we have twins." And let me get a note here. And he said, "That's really strange because I work for the Minnesota Twins." And that was sort of a coincidence. Shortly afterwards, another nurse came in and she said to another one of the gentlemen, "Congratulations, you are the father of triplets." He said, "Really?" Said, "There was no indication of that, but it is strange that I work for 3M. And naturally, the third one came in and congratulated the man who is father of quadruplets. And he said, "Well," he said, "that's kind of strange because I work for Four Seasons hotel system." And they looked around, and the 4th one was beating his head against the wall and just moaning and carrying on. The other 3 asked him, said, "What is the problem with you? What's wrong? Could we help?" He said, "I work for 7-Up." Indeed. We're ready for our speaker now, and I believe this is about her 3rd Sunday from the termination. and will certainly miss her. For a short period of time.
I hope you're not firing me for good. Okay. If I start looking off this way or down here, you just have to be with me because the clock back here is not on the right time and it's stuck. So otherwise, you might not get to church on time if I get going. Good. It's nice to see such a good crowd. Today, I want to continue our series on questions that Jesus poses in the Gospel of Luke and what we can learn from them by sharing his queries. And today I'm going to be in a familiar story. The setting is the city of Jerusalem. More specifically, Jesus is sitting at the table with his disciples eating a Passover meal. In this place and in this time, we are told by the writer of Luke that a dispute arose among several of them, his closest followers, sitting at that table. Now, the word for dispute is kind of fun here. It is philonokia, which literally means a love of strife. You have to kind of laugh. While some of us may say that the term indicates that they were a quarrelsome bunch, I would say it's more likely that they were engaging in the kind of bickering that happens between siblings or sometimes even spouses, the people that we're close to. You know what I mean, the jostling over things that maybe seem a little bit inconsequential, that basically demonstrates that there's a point of tension that needs to be worked out, but it's avoiding what the real issue is. And so I'm going to give you that sense of the word. Now, why do I say that this issue was inconsequential? Well, the text tells us that the dispute revolves around their efforts to figure out which one of them in the time to come was going to be the greatest in the structure. The word here is megas. It may sound a bit silly to our ears. I think of it somewhat as a bunch of kids going shotgun, when you're getting ready to get in the car with your parents. We're going to call out which one we're going to be. Do they really think that they're going to be able to sort out leadership positions in the new movement this way? Do they even understand what leadership in this movement might entail? And do they really think that they are up to the task? Or do they know that they have the ability to get up to speed quickly enough? Jesus is going to raise every one of these issues with them. Moreover, I would add this point. Luke puts this story right here. And Luke is the only gospel that does that. And he does that for a reason. Because it is all too easy for us to miss how fraught the circumstances are in which this conversation is happening, and also how the placement resolves some other issues of tension. And I'm going to talk about both things. Let me start by reminding you that a Passover meal is a remembrance meal in the Jewish tradition. It's not just another occasion on the calendar. To read it that way misses some important components. First off, we are told in the book of Exodus that Passover is to keep present for every generation the story of how God brings the people out of Egypt, out of bondage, and into a new life. In this way, it is to serve as a reminder that God acts for the people, but that also God is always acting for the people in every generation, for their liberation, for their freedom. It's not a one and done kind of thing. In this way, the people are always reminded of their present circumstances. And in this time and in this place, they are under Roman occupation in Palestine. So we don't want to miss that fact. Indeed, the festival is a stark reminder that liberation has its painful and difficult components as well. It doesn't just magically happen when God says, and you're free. People are lost along the way, in the wilderness, in the struggle, coming into the promised land, and trying to maintain being the people in a place where there are lots of different empires prevailing, and now under the thumb of a government that is not of their choosing. Thus, we have to remember, number two, that this gathering of these disciples around this Passover table also has a political component to it. What I mean here is they are in Jerusalem, seated at a table with a man that the crowds have claimed is the anointed one to come, the Messiah. So the Romans are keeping a pretty close watch on what's happening with this group. They're under surveillance. In addition, the Jewish leaders are keeping a pretty close watch on this group and what's happening around them, because they have to keep the peace with the Romans, and so they are trying to make sure that everything stays together. But in addition, it's political within the group, because it's not accidental where Luke places this story. Our little story this morning is wedged between two other tales. Jesus has just finished informing the group that somebody at that table is planning to turn him over to the authorities. Jesus is fully aware that someone in his inner circle is seeking not to rock the boat and to take advantage of the circumstances in which this group finds itself. Right after this story, Jesus is going to inform Peter that he is going to deny him 3 times before the night is over. Even though Peter fiercely protests and says he's gonna fight for him, Jesus is like, no, that's not the way this is gonna happen. So our little story takes place in the middle of a lot of tension at this table. This is not a dinner that most of us would want to be at. Now, it's a pretty pressure-packed meal. But I believe this story is central to not only resolving all 3 of those stories about the disciples, but also to understanding something that we all need to be thinking about. Jesus asked them this question in our story. Who is greater? The one reclining, meaning the one sitting at the table in our parlance, they recline, or the one serving? That is, at this table, who has the most status, the power, the authority? Is that power or authority about being seated or reclined at the table, or is it about serving? It's an interesting question. We have to acknowledge that Jesus doesn't just flat out ask that question first. He sets them up to ask the question. So I'm going to go back. They're disputing amongst themselves. Jesus hears it. And the first comment he makes to engage them is this one. The kings of the Gentiles lord over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. Jesus starts out with letting them know something about how we in this world often assess greatest. What constitutes greatest? In the political realm, it's easy to see that people in power rule over what they control. They lord over, these kings lord over things. And that word lord literally is kuriuo, which comes from kurios, which is the word for Lord. So he says they lord over their territory. And if you lord over your territory, you can do the things that rulers do over your territory, right? You can levy taxes. You can raise an army. You can expect tokens of loyalty. And you can institute laws that people have to follow. We know that to be true even in our own political realm. Ex-governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, has a saying that he used to use when he was on the ABC News Weekly Roundtable. He says, elections have consequences. And what he meant by that was when you put people in power, you have to expect that they are going to do the things that power allows them to do. They're going to pass the laws they want to pass. They're going to appoint the judges they want to appoint. And they're going to redraw the districts so they don't get out of power. We know that to be true in our own systems. And so what Jesus is pointing out to them is that this is the way we know power works. Kings do lordly things. But Jesus also presses the case a bit here and talks about another group, benefactors, meaning people who have financial resources, ones we might think of as philanthropists. The term implies in our head people that are committed to doing good. But Jesus declares too that they also exercise, exousiazo, authority or power. He's pointing out that the money that these folks have gives them the latitude to prioritize what they deem to be important. But often, and so often what they do is simply give out of their own largesse without concerning themselves with the kind of substantive change that might be helpful. To help make the point, I want to go to Reinhold Niebuhr, theologian and writer, who said it this way: the powerful are more inclined to be generous than to grant social justice. What Jesus is saying is benefactors also exercise authority because money is power. And they give to the things that will allow them to feel as if they're doing good, but it doesn't fundamentally change the system that helps them be powerful. Jesus has gone on the offensive here. Now, while that's a good deal to take in on its own, Jesus has only gotten started. He says, if that's power the way that we know it, let me draw a contrast for those who are following me. He says, however, you are not like this, or not so with you. He says, if this is the way that the world does power, this is not the way we are. And he digs in with these words. Instead, let the greatest among you be as the younger, and the leader like one who serves. Now, the first part of that construction is a little bit weird to us, so I want to explain it. We have to remember that in this particular society, everything is constructed on a hierarchy. And it's a hierarchy built on the fact that eldest sons inherited. They got priority over everybody. So if you were the oldest, you had authority just by being born the oldest. Think Prince William. You know, you have the heir and the spare. Poor Harry. Now, so what we're doing is we're talking about a system that's built that way. But also in relationships, in work things, in this Greco-Roman culture, you had elder friends and younger friends, elder workers and younger workers. And the elder always held more power. But Jesus is pointing out in this system, it might be topsy-turvy. That the greatest among you might be the youngest. And the leader among you might be not what you are expecting, but rather one who serves. The word here is not unimportant. It is diakoneo. It's where we get our word deacon from. And you probably know that the word deacon in this context means table servant. Someone who waits on tables. So it's not unintentionally used that those sitting at the table are talking about power, and he's saying, I would be looking for power at the ones who are waiting on this table. What I want to talk about is that Jesus is setting forward a theme here that really sounds shocking to us, but ought not to be shocking to them. Because it's the kind of thing Jesus has been about with them all along. Think back into the gospel. Jesus, for instance, was always about feeding people. The church in its first century mission was all about feeding people. In fact, if you look back to the book of Acts, part 2 of the book of Luke, by the same writer, why were deacons chosen in the first place? To do the food distribution to those who didn't have enough, widows and orphans, on a daily basis. Make sure that they were waited on, taken care of. It is a way, feeding is important because it meets your physical needs, but it was also a way of Jesus communicating to people that they were loved, that they were cared for, that they were safe, that they were nurtured. They are, in short, seen in a world that doesn't often see everybody who doesn't have. Jesus is welcoming people to his table. To help us understand that concept, I had to go to a book that I really like. It's by Perry Coleman Magnus. She's a native of Memphis, Tennessee. And she wrote this book in 2018. It's called The Southern Sympathy Cookbook, Funeral Food with a Twist. You ought to read it. I'm going to read you part of her introduction. She says, funerals in the South are synonymous with food. Small town communities, urban social circles, and religious congregations can pull together a plan with a rapidity and precision world military leaders can envy. Phone trees, sign-up sheets, and now email blasts and text change organize everything a grieving family could need. The table at any visitation, celebration of life, or homegoing is like a local encyclopedia of foodways, or a precise study in the anthropology of a society. And yes, that does include if you just stopped at the KFC and bought a bucket. What Magnus is recognizing here is that in moments of need, of pain, and of loss, moments that mark our lives, communities can and should come together, and feeding is often a symbol of that. It's one of the reasons why Jesus feeds people all the time. I adore one of the stories, I just have to keep going on with her for a minute, that she shares about this practice. This is one she writes. She says, Julia Reed puts it most succinctly. She tells the story of her grandparents' unexpected death in an accident. The dreaded call came, and her mother leapt into action to make all the necessary arrangements. Knowing what was to come, as she rushed out of the house, she gave Julia one instruction: go clean out the refrigerator. Now, it's a funny story, but one of the things that I think it tells you about community is that Julia's mother knew that the one and only thing she wouldn't have to arrange was food. She knew her community was going to come through in that way. But again, for Jesus, the table isn't just about food. Food is important, it's a good sign, but it's also a convenient metaphor for the social order. He tells a parable in chapter 14 about attending a Sabbath meal, and he sees all the people taking the so-called places of honor. In our parlance, those people wouldn't be sitting over in the kitchen or at the bar or at the folding table. They were going to the dining room table and taking their seats. And he tells this parable, and he says, well, when you're invited to such a feast, you shouldn't take the place of honor, because then the host who invited everybody might have to say to you, really, somebody else needs to be sitting here, not you. He says, rather, you should take the lowliest seat. And so then the host is able to say, hey, come on over. You should always be thinking about being in the most humble place. So in that text, it's where the followers should take a seat. In our text, he's telling his followers, you shouldn't be worried about sitting at all. Still, when Jesus finally goes on to pose the question he has seemingly already answered, there's still more to be discovered. So let's look at it again. Because after he set them up, then he asked this question. Who is greater, the one at the table or the one who serves? And he immediately follows it up with another question. Is not the one reclining or at the table the greater one? Not wanting them to miss the point, Jesus adopts the time-tested technique. He posed the rhetorical question where the answer should have been obvious. Of course, the one sitting down in the world scheme of order is the one with more authority. Why, we ask, does Jesus then pose this question? That answer is simple. He's pointing out to the disciples sitting around this table that the social norms and customs that are ingrained in them from childhood about who sits where and how authority is handled have to be rethought. He wants them to recognize, in opposition to what many of them feel in their bones, that when the reign of God comes into being, those who are following him shouldn't be expecting to be sitting around the table. They shouldn't expect power in that kingdom to look like anything they've ever seen before. He wants them to recognize that their go-to model is not where the work of God is. He has to upend their expectations. That conclusion takes away then what Judas is doing, right, in the story before. Judas is still in that power structure, and he's afraid to rock the boat. So Jesus has just solved that question. But it's also going to undercut those followers sitting there wondering who the greatest was, because he finishes with this statement. But I am among you, Jesus says, as one who serves. He turns the spotlight on himself, and he says, let's look at what we're doing here. He tells them to pay attention to how he moves, how he positions himself, and what they have seen all along the way leading up to this moment. And second, he's telling them, I'm not asking you to cede any place at the table that I myself am not willing to cede, have not ceded. Indeed, I want you not to rush past this and miss something else very subtle that happens in this passage. It goes back to Passover. They're sitting there at the Passover table. And at that Passover table, if you know anything about that meal, it ain't a meal you have sitting down in the book of Exodus. What does the book of Exodus tell you? This is how you will eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you eat it fast. Because you're on your way out to liberation. This is not where you're sitting around in Egypt at the table thinking about how power is going to be in the new day. It's where you get your tail end on the road because you have work to do to liberate, to be liberated, to get on your way to the covenant. Peter's approach is now off the table as well. I'm ready to fight for you, Lord, he has told him. And he's like, no, Peter. You're not ready. You're going to deny me 3 times because you're too busy caught up in the power structure. Even more important, in Jesus' statement about service, he points them back to what he has done before he tells them one will betray them. He goes back to how he did the Passover meal. I am one, he says, behold, let me get the exact words, I am among you as one who serves. What did he tell them just minutes before when he was sharing the meal with them? This is my body, which is given for you. This is the cup that is poured out for you, the new covenant of my blood. Lordship and being a benefactor in Jesus' world is not predicated on holding on to rule and authority or on wealth. Rather, Jesus' status as Lord is predicated on his willingness to sacrifice his life so that they might be free. He is telling them in his last moments with them that night, before he is arrested, that this kind of service is what his followers have to embody. That's where greatness is. It reminds me this morning, in the context of Luke, of us singing Christmas carols. Because if you remember, this is where Luke's wrapping up the story of Jesus. Where does Luke start it? With a visitation to Mary, his mother, by the angel Gabriel, who tells her, you're going to bear the Son of the Most High, and he's going to be this incredible figure. And what does Mary say? Here I am, the servant, here doule, of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. She models the kind of humility that Jesus is seeking amongst his followers. She recognizes in her subsequent prayer of praise that in her embrace in this role, the world itself will be turned upside down the way Jesus is telling them that it will be turned upside down if they can see it. Will these disciples be able to understand and to embody what Jesus is telling them? Will they get a grasp on the idea that the one who serves is the one who is doing what God considers to be great? Are we able to get that message? The writer of Luke is asking us to think about that question. Anybody got a question? Yes, June.
In an ordinary family, just in Jesus' time, who would do the cooking and serving?
All right, she asked a good question. She said, in an ordinary family in Jesus' time, who would do the cooking and the serving? Depends on your social status. In an ordinary, not so well-to-do family, that cooking would be the task of the women, and the serving would be the task of the women. And if you were a little bit more well-to-do, it would be the task of your slaves or your servants. So it depends on the social status of your family. Most people know that Luke presents a picture of a whole group that traveled with Jesus that helped provide for him all of the things that they needed. And that group would have included women. So they're here in this conversation too. Yes, June?
How do we know how the story of Jesus' birth and the announcement, how do we know all that?
It's an interesting question. How do we know all of that? These things are created after the life of Jesus. I can't verify their authenticity for you in any other way than they are memories of the community that are passed down. And they vary. So that's all I can tell you. Yes, comes back here.
Referring to Jesus' mother Mary, you said doule.
Uh-huh.
Is that where we get the word doula?
It is absolutely where we get the word doula. It's doule, which means servant or slave, and it is where we get the word doula from. You're welcome. Yes.
Jesus usually welcomes his people that he serves, regardless of. And how could we do that in our days to hold the dignity of people that we serve, that we Lord over them?
I think that's a really important question. She was talking about how Jesus welcomed the people that he served, and we need to greet people with the dignity and the respect that Jesus showed them. And I think that that's one of the challenges he puts before his followers, because he's sort of reminding them, especially in this text, that all these sort of status designators are going to be leveled in the time of God. And so that the point is not to see necessarily the social rank, but to see the person and to see the need. and to see with the eyes of love. And so he's asking us to do, I'll go back to my doula training, what they're teaching us in doula training, unconditional positive regard for everybody that we encounter. And that's a task, because it goes against everything ingrained in us to do. Well, that was good, thank you. I hope everybody has a good week, and I think we have, to get to your point, 2 weeks left while I'll be here.
Thank you, Sandy, thank you. Sandy will be back with us next week and the following week. In the pulpit today, Newton Cowan will be preaching. Now, if you'll stand, we'll have a closing prayer. Help us, oh God, when we're at the crossroads of doubt and faith. May your word always shine as a beacon of light to us in our times of uncertainty. There are things we must change. Give us faith to make a start. And then the faith to keep on. There are things we must bear. Keep us from trying to avoid the struggle. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good to see you, buddy.
Nice to see you, Patty. Yeah, I can't wait to hear more.